Welcome everybody to the next show of CFO Inside TV. I'm very happy to have you all here again as our visitors. And I'm also very happy to have Allan Russell of SAS Institute, a SAS fellow, here with us today. Welcome,
Good afternoon.
Allan. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks.
Starting off, since you're a SAS fellow, can you tell us a little bit more about what exactly that interesting role title actually means?
Okay, well, I guess since I've been in the company rather a long time, eventually the folks start to see that maybe it would be good to have somebody looking at stuff a little bit off the beaten track, not just the day job all the time. And so I actually do have a day job as the head of the Risk Centre of Excellence, but I also have an opportunity to go off and research and look at other topics that are usually quite risk-related, but not necessarily specifically in line with my day job all the time.
Okay, what are these? Can you give a general example?
Yes. One of the big things that I've been looking at for a number of years is really a kind of fundamental question: what is business intelligence? We spend an awful lot of time worrying about reports and how do we get reports out, but we don't always think about what we use these reports for. Yeah. And we tend to use them, hopefully, to make decisions, and those decisions are usually part of some business process. So how can we link business intelligence, decision-making, and process automation or process understanding in a more tight way?
Okay, we might come back to that later. For a start, you're mainly working with the risks in the financial industry, if I understand correctly.
That's right, banking, capital markets, and insurance.
Yeah, what's the big issues there at the moment?
Well, I guess there's a couple of big issues. The big thing that everybody's concerned about is regulation. We have Solvency II going on in the insurance world, which is a massive amount of data collection, data refining and reporting. We have in the banking world the Basel III legislation, which is increasing the amount of transparency that's required around areas like liquidity, counterparty risk. So regulation and how to comply and keep going with that and keep the costs under control is one of the major things that people are concerned with. But of course, at the same time, they have to run a business and they have to actually return to their stakeholders or bring a return to their stakeholders. And so the whole idea of transparency and how do we understand what's going on in our institution, how do we make the best out of it, is something that is also a concern alongside this regulatory focus.
Now, the interesting thing about the financial industry is basically that as a business, they take on risk compared to other businesses that usually do not try to take on risk. But the financial industry is actually using that as a model. At the same time, we saw that a lot of financial institutions were not exactly good at managing their risk, as we saw with Lehman Brothers and others. So would you say the financial industry is ahead or behind in terms of their risk management compared to other industries?
I think they're, as you mentioned, it's a little bit different because they have an active role to take on risk as opposed to a more defensive role in other businesses. I think they've got a lot more techniques and technology to deal with risk because of that. Does that mean they always use it correctly, and does it mean that they always use the information they have to make the right decisions? That's a much more fundamental question. But I think they are, in fact, pretty far ahead in terms of the way they go about dealing with risk.
What do you think other companies could learn from that?
I think one of the big things that there's been a lot of emphasis on over the last little time is transparency, and that's linked to risk identification. Where do we have our risks? What do we do to mitigate those risks? How much should we spend to mitigate a risk entirely? I mean, it's impossible to do, maybe, but you've got various levels of that. And I think one of the things that I've noticed over the years is that the operational risk programs that they're dealing with under Basel II, for example, force them to be a lot better at describing their organisation. Who's doing what? Where are we taking risks? And I think that was a kind of big unknown in the past. Okay. And to some extent, I think that's also what bit the financial industry is. They didn't really know what risks they'd taken on.
Moving on from risk to the other thing that you're working on is big data, which is closely related. You already mentioned the heaps amounts of data that companies are storing due to regulation and all that. What is your big data is a very fuzzy term somehow. Everybody's using it. Everybody wants to use it. At the same time, I feel few people actually understand how to mine all that data. What is a big issue with big data at the moment?
I think I'd agree with you. Big data is a rather fuzzy term, and But even though it's fuzzy, I think it is actually quite a useful term, because you often find that at the higher levels of organizations, they don't really understand the resource they have available to them in terms of the data. And the whole naming of that big data and giving it a name has been sort of good for popularizing it, even if doesn't go very deep. What we see is that as the world becomes more and more digital, there's just more data around there. Imagine every part of every car having an IP address, how much data is flowing around. So, the volumes of data are growing and growing and growing. It's impossible to say really, 1 gigabyte small and 2 gigabytes big, or terabyte or whatever. It's more a sort of state of mind that we have more data than we can currently process.
Yeah.
Now, in the risk world, when you start looking at simulations and the number of different scenarios and instruments you have, then the data volumes grow and you certainly start to see big data emerging.
But one problem with big data is that it's pretty random sometimes and chaotic. I think that's exactly the problem. A lot of companies store data that just happen to come in from social networks from somewhere else, but don't really know how to use them afterwards because they're not pre-structured. Is there a way of dealing with that, or do you just have to live with that?
No, well, you can live with it and deal with it, both at the same time. There are some new techniques coming along in areas like data storage, for example, storing large amounts of unstructured data and finding things in it quickly. I'm thinking there of some of the database technologies like Hadoop that let you do that, searching through mounds and mounds and mounds of unstructured data. But of course, just finding stuff's not all that it's about. You have to be able to analyze it. And we, for example, have spent quite some time in research over the last few years looking at how to, if you will, mine structured data to find stuff out about it. So, we can look at a whole collection of millions of statements and tell you which ones are positive, which are negative, and which are neutral, which, if you're looking at how your marketing campaign is going, might be a good thing to know.
Well, thanks, Allan. Very interesting. We have 3 final questions for you, as with all our guests, with a request for a very short answer, ideally yes or no. My first question would be, would you say that more regulation in the financial sector does lead to better risk management?
Yes and no.
Okay, we take it like that. Do executives today understand the risk of their businesses in general better than they did 20 years ago?
Kind of. So in some ways, yes, but not as well as they should.
Okay. And do you think that too much information, as in big data, could actually also cloud the view for proper strategic decisions?
I think you have to. Well, no, I don't. And I can explain why not. I think you have to think about the decisions you're making and have quite clear framework for what's a day-to-day operational decision that happens thousands of times a day, what's a more tactical decision, planning, cyclical, monthly planning, and what's a strategic decision. And I think if you're careful and keep those 3 things clearly identified in a framework, then there shouldn't be so much danger.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Allan.
Thanks
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining us again, and I look forward to seeing you again next week for our next show of CFO Inside TV.